You know that feeling when you wake up after a massive, chaotic, incredibly loud party?
Oh yeah, the kind where your ears are still ringing.
Exactly. The kind of night where the music was just vibrating in your chest, the strobe lights were blinding, and you were like entirely swept up in the sheer momentum of the crowd.
Right, right.
But then the sun comes up, the music stops, you step outside into the cool morning air, and you sit down by the fading embers of the bonfire from the night before.
And suddenly it's quiet.
Yeah. For the first time in hours, the world is actually quiet enough for you to hear your own thoughts. And you find yourself staring into those embers, suddenly asking yourself, why do I feel a little empty right now?
It's the psychological hangover of a remarkably loud era. I mean, you're describing that sudden, jarring pivot from pure, unadulterated escapism to, well, an unavoidable, quiet introspection.
Spot on.
The ringing in your ears finally fades and you're just left with yourself.
Exactly. And that exact pivot, that moment of quiet, confusing introspection, is where we are taking you today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
We are so glad you're joining us.
We really are, because today we are going back to a decade that shaped, almost every single aspect of how you live right now, whether you realize it or not. Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a truly fascinating, completely unique document today.
It really is unique.
Yeah, it's simply titled Addy 1990's.pdf. And what makes this stack of notes so special is that it doesn't just give us like a dry textbook history of the 1990s. It looks at the entire decade through what it calls the Addy lens.
Right. And to clarify for you listening, this Addy lens is a very specific philosophical perspective. It's a way of looking at history that centers on joy, on spontaneity, on the visceral, lived human experience.
The day-to-day stuff.
Exactly. It's about maintaining a kind of grief-aware resilience, finding presence without pressure. But crucially, and this is the key to the entire document, it's about having enough heart to notice the shadows hiding underneath the neon lights.
It's the ultimate vibe check of history, to be honest. And our mission today, for you, is to figure out how this decade, the 1990s, functioned as the literal rehearsal dinner for the 21st century.
I love that phrasing, rehearsal dinner.
Right. We are going to explore how a decade that felt so promising, so full of shared culture and, fetical connection, secretly built the architecture for the anxious, hyper-connected, deeply fragmented world we all live in today.
It's a wild transition when you really look at it.
It is. But I'm looking at these sources, and it seems like to understand the 90s, we can't just start the clock in January 1990. We have to look at the party that came right before it, really.
Absolutely. We have to step back into the 1980s because the 1990s did not happen in a vacuum. You cannot understand the introspective shift of the 90s without understanding the extreme extroversion of the decade that preceded it.
The 1980s were loud.
So loud. The text describes the energy of the 1980s perfectly. It says bigger, louder, flashier. It was an era of expression without apology. You
Yeah.
have bright neon colors, you have the massive hair, the incredibly bold fashion.
And the music.
Yeah, the music wasn't just meant to be played. It was meant to dominate the physical space you were in.
The 80s were like a stadium rock concert where the amplifiers are pushed past their limit. The document paints this incredible cinematic picture. Late afternoon, golden light bouncing off chrome cars, someone blasting synth pop from a cassette player.
Such a specific mood.
Yeah, you had arcade machines buzzing and flashing like digital beehives, pulling kids into these early pixelated worlds. You had Walkmans letting people carry their music around like a personal soundtrack for the very first time. It was this massive, shiny playground.
But underneath all that playfulness, there was a shadow. There was immense pressure building. What's fascinating here is that you still had the lingering existential dread of the Cold War.
Oh, right. The nuclear threat.
Exactly. The threat of nuclear annihilation was a very real, ambient hum in the background of everyday life. And to cope with that, consumerism ramped up to unprecedented levels, pushing this narrative that, more is always better.
Shopping as a coping mechanism.
Basically, yeah. People were chasing wealth and success as a form of armor, but often losing themselves in that pursuit. The optimism was genuine, but it was fragile. It was a setup decade. People were experimenting and escaping, but they weren't fully processing what was happening to their society.
Which is exactly why that bonfire analogy works so well. The 80s were like dancing around this massive roaring fire, laughing a little too loud, trying your hardest not to look out into the dark woods.
That's exactly it.
But, as the text points out, joy and chaos are dance partners. Eventually, the fire dies down. The 90s are the moment you sit by the embers and finally ask, is this all there is? Even when everything looks shiny and good, why do I feel this void?
And that introspective, almost existential shift in the cultural mood coincided with, and was arguably triggered by, one of the most sudden tectonic shifts in global power in modern history.
It was a massive shock to the system.
The world order literally changed overnight.
Okay, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone waking up back then. Let's look at the geopolitics. Waking up in a unipolar world. The biggest geopolitical fact of the early 90s, hands down, was the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
A monumental event.
The bipolar system of the Cold War, this massive standoff that defined everything, just evaporated. I'm trying to imagine waking up the day after the Soviet Union collapsed. What do you even do?
It's hard to even fathom now.
Right. Who is the bad guy now? What happens to the psychology of a country when its defining enemy just quits?
What's fascinating here is the sheer cognitive dissonance it creates. For nearly half a century, the United States had a defining storyline. It was an existential us versus them.
It was in all the movies.
Oh, everywhere. Every political move, every cultural narrative, every action movie was colored by the Cold War. It was the organizing principle of American identity. Then the Soviet Union disintegrates. The Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet republics declare independence, and the Cold War simply ends.
Just like that.
Just like that. The United States is suddenly standing alone at the center of a unipolar world. They are the undisputed lone superpower in what President George H.W. Bush called a new world order. And logically, people expected fireworks.
Like a big victory parade.
Yeah, they expected a massive collective sigh of relief and a happily ever after feeling. But they didn't get that.
They got a weird, empty confusion instead. The text says it felt more like relief mixed with a strange emptiness. Because humans, fundamentally, need a storyline.
We do. We run on narrative.
We like having a narrative that explains our place in the world and gives our actions meaning. When that narrative vanished, people looked around and thought, okay, we won, but who are we now?
Exactly. It exposed a profound lack of identity. Without the Soviet Union as a foil, the United States had to figure out what it actually stood for, rather than just what it stood against. And the U.S. tried to fill that void with an immense projection of confidence.
Like the 1991 Gulf War.
The 1991 Gulf War is the prime example.
Right, Operation Desert Storm.
Right, Operation Desert Storm. But wasn't that a good thing for the national psyche at the time? I mean, from the source material, it sounds like we proved we were the undisputed top dog. We repelled the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in, a matter of weeks?
It was an incredible military success, yes. It was an early test of this post-Cold War power. It was fast, it was highly technological, and crucially, it was watched live on television.
CNN had it on loop.
Right, people were watching laser-guided munitions hit targets through green night vision lenses on CNN. It gave the U.S. military and the public this massive injection of confidence, a belief that the ghost of the Vietnam War had finally been exorcised.
A clean victory. American power had found its footing. It looked like the New World Order was going to be clean, decisive, and entirely managed by American leadership.
But the reality, as the decade wore on, was vastly different, and the Addy lens catches this perfectly. It's that moment where the room suddenly goes quiet and you realize the chaos still has teeth.
A very harsh realization.
Because while the U.S. felt absolutely unbeatable militarily, the 90s kept whispering a very dark lesson. Power is not the same as wisdom. Just because you have the biggest hammer doesn't mean you know which nails to hit.
That is the crucial distinction. The blind spots were massive. The decade exposed catastrophic failures of prevention and response.
It's sobering to read about.
It is. The text specifically highlights the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 and the mass killings in Bosnia between 1994 and 1995. These were horrific, systemic atrocities occurring while the lone superpower struggled with moral uncertainty.
Let's break that down, though. If the U.S. was the undisputed superpower, why did they struggle? Why didn't they just step in and stop it the way they did in Kuwait?
Because the underlying mechanics of global intervention had completely lost their clarity. During the Cold War, the U.S. intervened globally to stop the spread of communism. It was a strategic imperative.
It was the storyline.
Exactly. But in Rwanda, a horrific genocide unfolded, where an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were murdered in 100 days. There was no communist threat there. There was no oil.
There was no immediate American interest.
Right. So the Clinton administration and the international community at large got bogged down in debates over terminology like whether to officially call it a genocide and logistical hesitation. They had the power to intervene, but they lacked a coherent moral framework for when and why to do so when their own immediate interests weren't threatened.
That is incredibly dark. And it happened again in the Balkans, right?
Yes, the breakup of Yugoslavia led to brutal ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, most notably the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. The U.S. and NATO eventually intervened with airstrikes, which led to the Dayton Accords, but the hesitation allowed massive atrocities to occur.
Just terrible.
And later, the conflict in Kosovo underscored that even a post-Cold War Europe was not automatically peaceful.
Think about the absolute psychological whiplash of that for the listener. Imagine you are sitting in your living room in the mid-90s.
Watching the evening news.
Yeah. On one channel, you're watching these incredibly clean, high-tech military victories or diplomatic handshakes on the evening news, being told that the world is safer than ever, the end of history has arrived. And then you change the channel and see the sheer, unmitigated horror of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. And you realize the moral limits of all that shiny global power.
It breaks the illusion.
It really does. You realize the New World Order has massive, bloody cracks in its foundation.
It forced a deeply uncomfortable realization. Civilians experienced war largely through screens, not through a domestic draft or rationing. So conflict became this surreal background noise. It was a mix of patriotic spectacle and deeply disturbing foreign policy failures.
A weird vibe to live through.
It was a victory geopolitically, but it felt hollow. The U.S. was the global police force, but it didn't know what the laws were supposed to be anymore.
And winning a Cold War doesn't exactly pay the mortgage, does it? That feeling of a hollow victory bled right into the domestic side of things. Because global dominance didn't translate into stability at the average American kitchen table.
No, it did not.
Which takes us into the economic split personality of the 1990s.
Yes, the 1990s economy is truly a tale of two entirely different halves. We often remember the 90s as this era of boundless prosperity, the dot-com boom, the budget surplus. But it certainly didn't start that way. The decade opened with the 1990 to 1991 recession.
Okay, I want to stop here because the text mentions a jobless recovery following that recession. What exactly does that mean? How can an economy recover if people don't have jobs?
It's a great question because it's a deeply frustrating economic concept. A jobless recovery means that the macroeconomic indicators, things like gross domestic product, corporate profits, and overall economic output, start going back up after a recession.
So the charts look good.
The charts look great. The economy is technically growing again, but employment numbers lag far behind. Companies figured out how to produce more with fewer people.
How? Just making people work harder.
Partly, but largely through automation, computerization, and massive corporate restructuring. Companies realized during the recession that they could trim their workforce, invest in new software or machinery, and maintain the same level of output.
Oh, I see.
So when the economy recovered, they didn't hire those workers back. This framed the early part of the decade with intense insecurity. People were reading in the paper that the recession was over, but they were still sending out resumes and getting nothing back.
That's maddening. But then the narrative shifts completely. We get to the second half of the decade, the celebrated late 90s boom, and the numbers from the source text are wild.
They really are.
Unemployment drops down to around 4%. You have stronger productivity growth. Stock prices, especially in the tech sector, are absolutely surging. We even had federal budget surpluses by the end of the decade, meaning the government was actually bringing in more money than it was spending.
Which is almost unheard of today.
Exactly. Everyone was popping champagne over the new economy, convinced that technology and internet efficiency had basically solved the boom and bust business cycle forever.
It was an era of managed abundance for those who could access it. But that access is the crucial caveat.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you look at those macro numbers, the stock market soaring, unemployment at historic lows, you would think everyone was doing great. But if the economy was booming so loudly, why did so many regular people feel so deeply insecure?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why was there this underlying hum of anxiety that the Addy text keeps pointing to?
Because of the illusion of the new economy. The prosperity was very real. But the distribution of that wealth was radically uneven. The text points to census data showing that median new home prices in 1990 were relatively accessible in the low 100,000s nationally.
Wow.
Full-time median weekly earnings were in the hundreds. So a middle-class household could still plausibly imagine homeownership, a couple of cars, an annual vacation. The baseline of the American dream was still somewhat intact compared to the housing crises we'd see in the 21st century.
Right, but the massive exponential gains of the 90s, the kind of wealth that makes the evening news, weren't happening in traditional jobs. The explosive wealth was concentrated in finance, in the booming technology sectors, and asset markets.
Exactly.
If you had a college degree, lived on the coasts, and had access to those growth sectors, you were riding the wave of the future. If you didn't, you were just treading water.
And the nature of financial stress fundamentally shifted during this decade. It wasn't about a sudden systemic collapse of the banking system or the housing market. The stress of the 90s was quieter, more insidious.
The slow bleed.
Exactly. It was the slow bleed of credit card balances piling up as consumer culture expanded. It was the sudden realization of gaps in medical coverage as healthcare costs began to outpace inflation. It was the anxiety over paycheck timing. And most importantly, it was a profound, creeping vulnerability to layoffs driven by globalization.
Let's talk about globalization because it feels like the absolute core tension of this era. The source text brings up NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement signed in 1993. I need to explain it like I'm 5 on this. What did NAFTA actually do mechanically, and why was it such a big deal?
Simply put, NAFTA was an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to eliminate most tariffs and trade barriers between the three countries.
Okay, so no tariffs.
Right. A tariff is basically a tax on imported goods.
Right.
By removing those taxes, the idea was to create a massive, unified, seamless trading bloc. The prevailing economic theory, championed by both Republicans and the Clinton administration, was that free trade would lift all boats.
Make things cheaper, right.
Yes, it would make goods cheaper for consumers and open up new markets for American exports. And in 1995, this globalist push continued with the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to regulate global trade rules.
But globalization in the 90s operated as a massive paradox. It seems like it was amazing for consumers, but terrifying for workers.
Precisely. On one side of the ledger, it brought immense consumer benefits. Goods became significantly cheaper. You walk into a big box store, and suddenly clothing, toys, and electronics are incredibly affordable because they're being manufactured overseas where labor is vastly cheaper.
And culture mixed, too.
Oh, absolutely. Culture flowed freely. The world felt smaller, more interconnected, and more accessible.
The Addy perspective nails this. It was like traveling the entire world without ever leaving your house, which is incredibly exciting. You're sitting in suburban America, and the whole globe is being delivered to your local mall.
But there's a flip side.
But let's look at the other side of that ledger. If I'm a factory worker in Ohio in 1994, here is exactly what my Tuesday looks like. The goods are moving freely, but the company I work for just realized it's cheaper to move my factory to Mexico or Asia because the tariffs are gone. So while I can buy a cheaper TV at the store, I no longer have the paycheck to afford it.
It created a fractured reality. For the upper middle class, the knowledge workers, globalization meant cheaper electronics, diverse food options, and rising mutual funds as corporations became more profitable.
They were winning.
They were. But for the working class, as you said, it meant the factory down the street closing and their stable, unionized job being shipped across the world. They were told by the news anchors and the politicians that the economy was better than ever, but they were looking at their own shrinking paychecks, their hollowed-out towns, and asking, wait, where did my job go? Am I not part of this new economy?
It's the beginning of a really terrifying question. If everything is mixing globally and my specific local job is gone, where do I belong?
It's a deep identity crisis.
If you're that Ohio factory worker, you're not just losing your income, you're losing your sense of place and identity in the American fabric. And that profound economic disorientation, that sense of the floor quietly shifting under people's sneakers, naturally bled into how Americans viewed their own identities, their values, and their neighbors. Which means we need to talk about the culture wars.
To understand the cultural fracture of the 1990s, we first have to understand what the baseline normal looked like at the start of the decade. In the early 90s, the facade of normalcy leaned heavily toward heterosexual marriage, suburban aspirations, and a very unified mass-market consumer culture.
And religion played a huge part.
Crucially, yes. Christianity was the absolute public default. The Pew data in our source text notes that roughly 90% of U.S. adults identified as Christian in the early 90s.
90%. That is staggering when you look at today's demographics. It means religion wasn't just a personal, private belief system. It was the ambient noise of the country.
It was the foundation.
Churches were the primary civic hubs for communities. Political language was deeply steeped in moral, religious framing from both sides of the aisle. It was the absolute default setting of the American public square.
But that was the surface. Underneath that very polished traditional facade, the country was changing at a breakneck pace. The 90s became the battleground for immense debates over feminism, over multiculturalism, over what exactly constituted family values.
The demographics were changing
The
too.
demographic makeup of the country was shifting, with the foreign-born population rising sharply, leading to intense early debates over immigration and national identity.
The surface looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, but underneath, the pot was boiling, and you see this explode in the political flashpoints of the era. The decade bridged the gap between the older New Deal and Reagan eras, where there was at least a pretense of broad consensus, and the hyperpolarized, media-driven politics we have today.
A huge transition period.
You have the transition from George H.W. Bush, who masterfully managed the end of the Cold War geopolitically, but was completely undone by the 1990 recession, to Bill Clinton. And Clinton defined the decade with the strategy called triangulation. What does triangulation actually mean in practice?
Triangulation is a fascinating political mechanism. Coming into the 90s, Democrats had been locked out of the White House for 12 years under Reagan and Bush. They were viewed by many voters as too liberal, too soft on crime, and too tied to big government.
So they needed a rebrand.
Exactly. Clinton, as a new Democrat, realized he couldn't win with traditional liberal orthodoxies. So triangulation meant positioning himself above and between the left and the right.
Right in the middle.
He would adopt certain popular ideas from the Republicans, like being tough on crime or reforming welfare, but strip them of their most extreme elements, combining them with Democratic priorities like education or healthcare. He essentially stole his opponent's best talking points and neutralized them, claiming the sensible, pragmatic center.
Okay, so that explains how we get this massive avalanche of bipartisan, society-altering legislation in the mid-90s. And we need to look at these laws impartially because they completely rewired the country.
Let's start with the 1994 crime bill. What was the context and what did it actually do?
The context of the 1994 crime bill was a genuine, intense public fear of violent crime, which had peaked in the early 90s. The political pressure to do something was immense from both sides.
And mechanically, the bill did several things. It provided billions of dollars in funding to hire 100,000 new local police officers. It expanded the federal death penalty, and it implemented a federal three-strikes provision for repeat offenders. It also included a 10-year ban on certain assault weapons.
And it also included the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, right?
Yes, VAWA was a groundbreaking piece of legislation included within the broader crime bill. It provided massive federal funding for the investigation and prosecution of violent crimes against women, established the Office on Violence Against Women, and fundamentally shifted how domestic violence was treated by law enforcement, treating it as a serious public crime rather than a private family matter.
And then 2 years later, you get the 1996 Welfare Reform Law.
Correct. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. This was a classic example of Clinton's triangulation. The law fundamentally changed the welfare system by ending the federal guarantee of cash assistance for the nation's poorest children, turning the funds into block grants given to states to administer.
A huge shift.
It instituted strict work requirements and placed a 5-year lifetime limit on receiving benefits. The goal was to transition people from welfare to work, but it remains highly debated today regarding its long-term impact on deep poverty.
So the political machinery is churning out these massive laws, and the Supreme Court is busy too. The text mentions 2 massive cases, Planned Parenthood v. Casey and United States v. Lopez. Now wait, I thought Roe v. Wade was the definitive abortion ruling of the 20th century. What did Casey actually change in 1992?
It's a vital distinction. Roe v. Wade established the constitutional right to abortion. By 1992, many expected a newly conservative Supreme Court to overturn Roe entirely.
But they didn't.
No. In Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the court surprised many by formally upholding the core holding of Roe that women have a right to an abortion before fetal viability. However, how they evaluated the law changed.
How so?
Casey discarded Roe's trimester framework and instituted a new standard. States could regulate or restrict abortion access as long as those regulations did not place an undue burden or a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion.
So it kept the right intact, but opened the door for states to pass Waiting periods, parental consent laws, things like that, fundamentally altering access depending on what state you lived in.
Exactly. And United States v. Lopez in 1995 was equally seismic, but regarding federal power. For decades, the federal government had used the Constitution's Commerce Clause, its power to regulate interstate commerce, to justify passing a wide variety of laws, including a law banning guns in school zones.
Okay.
In Lopez, the Supreme Court struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act, ruling that carrying a handgun near school is not an economic activity that affects interstate commerce. It was the first time in half a century that the court had significantly restricted Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. It signaled a major shift towards states' rights.
So you have all this structural shifting, but how is the public experiencing this? Because it seems like politics wasn't viewed with the reverence of the post-WWII era anymore.
It wasn't. The way the public experienced politics was fundamentally changing. Trust in government had dipped severely during the early 90s recession and only slightly recovered during the economic boom. Politics began to be seen as noisy, cynical, and highly theatrical.
More like a reality show.
Exactly. The mood wasn't "the government will save us." It was, "Oh, great, these people are yelling on TV again."
The 247 cable news cycle was waking up. CNN had proven its power during the Gulf War, and now Fox News and MSNBC launched in 1996. And suddenly, news isn't a 30-minute broadcast at 6 p.m. It's a relentless, continuous feed that needs to keep you watching.
They needed eyes on the screen constantly.
Right, and to keep you watching, they began to reward scandal, urgency, and partisan repetition. Politics became an ongoing spectacle.
And that media spectacle was mirrored by deeply painful, undeniable cultural flashpoints that flatly contradicted the era's optimistic end-of-history rhetoric. We have to look at the 1992 Los Angeles unrest following the Rodney King verdict.
Let's approach this impartially as the text demands, because it's a critical moment of fracture. In 1991, Rodney King, a black motorist, was severely beaten by 4 white LAPD officers after a high-speed chase. Crucially, this was caught on videotape by a bystander.
Which was very rare back then.
It was one of the first times a viral video of police brutality was broadcast into everyone's living rooms. Then, in 1992, a predominantly white jury acquitted the officers, and Los Angeles exploded.
The unrest lasted for several days, resulting in over 60 deaths, thousands of injuries, and $1 billion in property damage. It sat squarely in the cultural memory as a haunting contradiction to the colorblind rhetoric preferred by politicians at the time.
It really shattered that narrative.
It exposed fundamentally differing realities. From one perspective, the unrest was the tragic but inevitable explosion of decades of systemic racism, police brutality, and economic neglect in inner-city communities. From another perspective, the violence, looting, and targeting of Korean-American business owners were seen as a breakdown of law and order that required immediate suppression.
It shattered the illusion of a unified monoculture. It forced the country to look at the shadows under the neon. It proved that while the broad script said America was becoming more open and prosperous, the lived reality for many was profoundly unequal, suspicious, and volatile.
The culture was splintering.
And you saw that splintering reflected perfectly in the pop culture of the decade.
The cultural output of the 90s was incredible because it fragmented in the most visceral ways possible. You went from the highly polished, synthesized corporate excess of the 80s into raw grunge, aggressive hip-hop, smooth R&B, and cynical alt-rock.
So different from the 80s.
The overall tone shifted entirely. It became more ironic, more intimate, and vastly more emotionally exposed.
The entertainment industry was fascinating because it was selling these contradictory messages. You had this massive push for girl power. You know, the Spice Girls, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a huge wave of strong female visibility in pop culture. It felt revolutionary. Yet, traditional gender hierarchies remained stubbornly entrenched in actual corporate workplaces and political institutions.
It was a weird mix of irony and sincerity.
Yeah.
You had MTV and 247 News rewarding outrage and scandal, while kids in flannel shirts in Seattle were listening to Nirvana, demanding authenticity, but pretending they didn't care about anything. The monoculture was actively cracking into subcultures.
All this cultural splintering, all this shifting identity, and then we take all of that tension and we drop a nuke on it. A beige plastic nuke sitting on a desk.
The personal computer.
No.
The tectonic shift of technology.
Yeah.
If one single element made the 1990s feel like the threshold of the future, it was the computer moving from being a highly specialized tool for engineers to an ordinary household object.
The dial-up doorway. Let's just sit with the visceral experience of the early internet for a second, because the Addy lens loves this lived experience. You want to go online in 1996. First, you put in one of the million AOL CD-ROMs you got in the mail.
They were everywhere.
Then you click connect, and your computer literally dials a phone number. You hear that screeching, static-filled 56K dial-up tone that sounded like a robot screaming in pain.
I can hear it now.
And the sheer hilarious practicality of the era. You literally could not use the landline phone in your house if someone was surfing the web. It was a physical constraint on digital life. Get off the internet, I need to use the phone, was a daily shout in households. And yet it was so incredibly new. The Pew statistic from the text is mind-blowing. In 1995, only 14% of U.S. adults had internet access.
Only 14%. It was a novelty. It was something you logged on to for an hour and then logged off to return to the real world. But the infrastructure was rapidly being laid down to change everything. And we have to look at the legislative architecture of this. The 1996 Telecommunications Act was a watershed moment.
Okay, stop there. What did a deregulation bill actually do to my internet or my media? How did it change things mechanically?
Prior to 1996, the government strictly regulated how many media outlets like radio stations or TV channels a single company could own in one local market. The goal was to ensure a diversity of local voices and prevent monopolies.
That makes sense.
The 1996 Telecommunications Act fundamentally deregulated the broadcasting and telecommunications markets. It lifted caps on ownership. The intent was to foster competition and allow telecom companies to cross into different markets, letting phone companies provide internet and cable companies provide phone service.
But the actual outcome?
The outcome was massive corporate consolidation. A few giant conglomerates bought up thousands of independent radio stations and local newspapers.
So fewer voices overall.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it opened the floodgates for the highly commercialized, consolidated media environment we grapple with today. It formally recognized that communications industries and the internet were no longer peripheral novelties. They were the new center of the global economy.
But for the person sitting at that beige keyboard, the real shift wasn't the corporate mergers. The real shift was what happened to human identity. I'm trying to think of an analogy. Think about it like this. The internet in the 90s was like discovering a hidden secret room in your house. And in this room, there's a massive trunk full of masks. You can walk into this room, put on any mask you want, and step out into this digital world as someone completely different.
That is a brilliant analogy. For the entire history of humanity prior to this, your identity was geographically and physically bound. You were defined by your physical town, your local high school, your immediate visible circle of friends and family.
Everyone knew you.
Suddenly, with the advent of chat rooms, message boards, and screen names, identity became flexible. It could be anonymous, it could be reinvented daily, it could be entirely fragmented from your physical reality. You could be a shy teenager in real life and a bold guild leader in an early online game.
The text calls it freedom with a modem attached. It was this deeply innocent, curious exploration at first. Whoa, I can type a message and someone in Australia reads it instantly. But it planted the seed for a massive psychological shift. The 90s were the absolute last decade where you could vanish for a weekend, just go off the grid, go camping, not answer your landline, and it wasn't weird.
Right, no one panicked.
But it was simultaneously the first decade where your online identity started to actually matter.
It was the birth of the question, who am I when no one physically watching me? And as the text astutely notes, once humanity asked that question, it never went away. It set the stage for the modern, hyper-curated, anxiety-inducing digital identities we navigate today. The freedom was exhilarating, but the fragmentation of the self began right there in those early AOL chat rooms.
Okay, let's pause. We are talking grand unified theories of technology, geopolitics, and economics. Let's bring it back to the Addy lens. What did a random Tuesday actually feel like for different people during this massive societal shift?
To understand the generational experience, we have to look at how different age groups navigated this in-between era. Let's start with the child of the 1990s. The text refers to this as the last analog childhood.
Oh, this hits so close to home. The child in the 90s is riding bikes until the streetlights come on. They're watching Saturday morning cartoons on a rigid television schedule. You couldn't just stream it. You had to physically be in front of the TV at 8 a.m. or you missed it.
Exactly. Or blowing into Nintendo cartridges.
They're blowing into the bottom of Nintendo cartridges to make them work. But crucially, the world felt big, and it felt safe, and it wasn't mediated by a screen in their pocket. Because the world wasn't fully online yet, imagination had to fill the gaps. You didn't know the answer to a question, so you just wondered about it.
They were completely insulated from the tectonic shifts we just discussed. They didn't feel the effects of NAFTA or the Telecommunications Act. They just felt the immediacy of physical play. But then you look at the teenager of the 1990s, and the picture changes dramatically. They are caught perfectly between the real and the digital.
The 90s teenager is fascinating. The local indoor mall was their social media. Hanging out at the food court, walking past the Sam Goody record store, that was how you curated your public image. You're spending hours burning custom mixed CDs for your crushes, which was basically the highest form of emotional currency.
It really was.
You're stretching the tangled, curled cord of the landline phone all the way into your bedroom closet so you can talk for 4 hours in private. But there is a deep emotional vibe here that the text captures perfectly. It's this incredibly complex mix of intense irony and hidden sincerity.
They were experiencing deep identity anxiety. Think about it. Pop culture is exploding with fragmented options. The early internet is whispering that they could be anyone. And traditional authority, post-Cold War, post-recession, felt less absolute.
So how did they deal with it?
So how do teenagers cope? They mapped their confusion with detachment. They acted incredibly chill, leaning into grunge or alternative apathy, whatever. But secretly, they were desperately searching for meaning and authentic connection. It was the crucible where modern identity anxiety really started cooking.
I'm figuring it out, but don't look too closely. That was the teenage anthem. Then you move to the adults of the 90s. They are managing the routines. They're adopting early tech-bomb, getting the first bulky desktop computers in their cubicles, maybe buying a brick-sized cell phone for emergencies. They're trying to ride the economic boom.
But they were feeling the immense pressure of keeping up appearances. For the upper middle class, the 90s sold a dream of managed abundance. You need the right suburban neighborhood, the right mutual fund portfolio, the right resume-building activities for the kids.
The perfect picture.
But for the working class, as we discussed, that dream felt increasingly distant. Adults were navigating this cognitive dissonance. They were wondering if their middle management jobs were actually secure in the face of corporate restructuring, even as the news anchors told them the economy was perfect. They were smiling and saying, "We're doing great," while lying awake worrying about the ground shifting beneath them.
And finally, you have the elders. The text points out there's a quiet sadness here. These are people who lived through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the height of the Cold War. They knew a world of slower rhythms and very clear existential moral battle lines.
It was a huge culture shock for them.
And now they're sitting in their living rooms watching the 24/7 cable news cycle explode over political scandals. They're watching values shift rapidly. They feel immense pride in the technological progress. Like, look, we have computers, but a deep alienating confusion over the new social norms. It's the feeling of, we built this world, but I don't fully recognize it anymore.
And tying all these generations together was a very specific, practical, daily vibe. Life in the 90s was not visually curated the way it is today for Instagram or TikTok.
Not at all. The food is the perfect example. It wasn't artisanal. It was incredibly practical, mostly beige, and heavily branded. We're talking microwave dinners, massive mall food courts, chain restaurants like Applebee's dominating the suburbs, the absolute obsession with elite or low-fat products that were actually just packed with sugar to make up for the lack of fat. It was a culture of convenience, layered over lingering traditions.
But amidst that branded convenience, the text highlights a crucial, lost element of the human experience that defined the decade. Boredom existed.
Yes, boredom, empty time.
Because relationships were face-to-face, and communication was tied to physical locations, landlines, physical mail, in-person hangouts. Life had friction. It was slow. And because you couldn't instantly escape into a smartphone when you had a free moment, you were forced to sit with your own thoughts.
You just had to wait.
You were forced to be bored. And paradoxically, that friction, that slowness, meant that when you did connect with someone, the relationship was often deeper and more intentional. You had to make an effort.
You had space to feel life. Which brings us to a massive contradiction. If we had this physical connection, this shared space, this slowness, how did we get from there to the highly anxious, hyper-connected, deeply fractured world we live in today? How does a decade so full of optimism birth the 21st century?
This raises an important question. What happens when a society fundamentally believes it has figured it out? The 90s were marked by an illusion of control. The Cold War was won, the stock market was soaring. Technology was viewed purely as a neutral tool for democratic progress.
The end of history.
Francis Fukuyama famously wrote about the end of history, suggesting Western liberal democracy was the final form of human government. But because of that supreme, blinding optimism, the decade was utterly blind to the massive warning signs it was generating.
The blind spots were massive. We've touched on them, but let's lay them all out. You had corporate restructuring and free trade globalization quietly hollowing out the working class, building the very foundation for the extreme wealth inequality we see today. You had the internet expanding at a breakneck pace with absolutely zero guardrails, no psychological understanding of how it would rewire human attention spans or spread misinformation.
Right.
You had the 204/7 news cycle beginning to sensationalize reality, eroding trust in institutions for profit.
And you had the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which served as a glaring, flashing warning light that was largely ignored in the West.
Wait, how does Thailand devaluing its currency hurt a teacher in Chicago? Why does that
It
matter?
proves exactly how fragile and volatile interdependent global capitalism had become. Thailand was forced to devalue its currency, the baht, after a speculative attack. Because the 90s had so deeply intertwined global financial markets that localized shock in Southeast Asia suddenly sent ripples across the entire globe.
A domino effect.
It spread to South Korea, Indonesia, Russia, and eventually caused a major hedge fund in the U.S. to collapse, requiring a bailout to prevent broader contagion. The interconnectedness that the 90s celebrated, the idea that open markets solve everything, was revealed to be a massive systemic vulnerability. Contagion was now instantaneous. But these warning signs were largely ignored because the overarching narrative of the U.S. tech boom was too seductive.
It's the central metaphor of the entire Addy document. The 1990s were a decade that was smiling with braces on. It's such a perfect, visceral image. Bright, awkward, highly optimistic, looking forward to the future, trying to look put together, but secretly underneath it all, a little bit uncomfortable, feeling the pressure, and a bit scared of the pain.
It perfectly synthesizes the overarching theme. The 1990s were the ultimate bridge. They were the transitional space between the analog, geographically bound industrial world of the 20th century and the hyper-connected, fluid digital world of the 21st century.
Standing in the doorway.
People were literally standing in a doorway. They had one foot rooted in local identities, slurred communication, and physical reality, and the other foot stepping into fluid digital identities, instant global connection, and complex 247 media realities.
And the tragedy, or maybe just the profound poetry of it, is that they had no idea they were about to walk through that doorway and never, ever come back. The 90s didn't just end on December 31st, 1999, when the ball dropped. They spilled forward. The seeds planted in the 90s, the digital divides, the political polarization driven by media, the reliance on endless financial growth, the identity anxiety grew into the towering realities we navigate every single day right now.
Exactly. The belief that technology and finance would simply keep prosperity humming indefinitely was incredibly seductive, but ultimately dangerously incomplete. We are living in the house that the 1990s built.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this today? We've taken you on a massive journey. We started in the loud, neon-soaked escapism of the 1980s, and we walked through a decade that quietly, systematically rewired our global power structures, our local economies, our culture, and ultimately, our very identities. The 1990s were the rehearsal dinner for the 21st century. The world opened up, borders thinned out, the screens lit up, and the concept of normal was fundamentally redefined.
But the beautiful takeaway from the Addy lens, the reason this document is so compelling, is this. You don't have to fully understand the grand historical narrative to live a full, meaningful life. The people living through the 1990s didn't wake up every morning thinking they were building the architecture of the modern internet or global supply chain.
So you were just living.
They were just living. They laughed with their friends at the mall. They stressed over paying their credit card bills. They listened to grunge music in their cars. They eagerly dialed up the internet to see if anyone messaged them, and they sought connection. They navigated the shifting floor beneath their sneakers with resilience and joy without fully knowing what was coming next. And there is profound humanity in that.
There really is. They were just trying to figure it out on a random Tuesday, just like we are today. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the Addy sources, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought. We talked a lot about the explosion of technology in the 90s, and we briefly touched on the concept of boredom. But I want you to really think about this. The 1990s were the very last time in the entirety of human history that our species experienced collective enforced boredom.
A truly lost experience.
When you were waiting for a bus or sitting in a doctor's waiting room or just existing on a quiet Sunday afternoon, you had no digital escape hatch. You couldn't swipe away the silence. You just had to sit there with your own mind, your own daydreams, and your own physical surroundings. So the next time you have a free minute today and you reach into your pocket to grab your smartphone out of pure habit, I want you to ask yourself a question. When we finally cured our collective boredom with that screaming dial-up tone, what vital, essential part of our human imagination did we accidentally leave behind, sitting by the fading embers of the 90s?